now we will have the chance for a 20-minute wrap-up. We will reflect on the dense input we got today. And I just want to briefly begin. We had a nice incident on Twitter because some people are really starting to think and starting to ask questions, especially concerning our T-shirts, which you have seen all day. My boobs are not for sale. Bart, maybe you could talk a little bit about the background of these T-shirts and why it is not so crazy to wear them after all.
Yes, and thank you on the people on Twitter who we discussed this, because it was exactly the point. We want to create awareness and a bit shock the audience, because it's really strange when two men start wearing such T-shirts. But it actually originated from a campaign that we started to learn on how to collect data through donations. And it was based on a breast cancer patient that approached me that actually said, like, let's do this together. And we then, it's like, how do we start? How do we start creating awareness? And we then had an Instagram filter that turned the breast into ASCII code, which is something really nerdy to do. And then people started using that Instagram filter in Ethiopia, in other regions, and we saw that actually you could create movement, you create awareness, and ASCII code. Why ASCII code? Well, because it's kind of code, data, it resembles the biological self and the informational self, and it's a symbolism. And then the title, of course, My Boobs Are Not For Sale, is my health data for breast cancer are not for sale.
Yeah, and you had quite some impact with that campaign, right?
Yeah, we started to get awareness. We had a partnership with a pharmaceutical company, so like we find this rewarding. So this kind of works. Like it created community, and then we won the German AI award from Axel Springer, Die Welt, which surprised me because we were not so far in our mission. But it showed that this awareness is there, and it creates that what it was intended for. What we needed is much more resources to scale this, but this is all a journey where we learn, and through that learning we can adopt. And now with this conference, we started to learn that we need to share much more knowledge. And I think today was really a great day, although there were some technical issues, so sorry for that, but everything is available for free. I always said that the goal of today was to create great content, and I think our contributors, which I'm really thankful for, created amazing discussion with amazing insights. And I think that's what was it about, like really sharing that knowledge, creating community. We have the Discord server now up, and that's what we're going to start continuing next year on a 2-weekly basis, sharing knowledge, and through that knowledge, trying to find solutions on how we can invent solidarity in the digital age powered by AI.
Definitely, and that's what we're going to do tomorrow as well. I'm looking forward to that, but now we're still here, and you've been working in big tech for, I think, nearly 20 years, and now you're dedicated to open source. So what's the motivation? Could you explain more upon that? What made you quit your job and say, I want to work in open source?
Well, yeah, that's I was always focused on healthcare, and I started as a kid. I lived quite remotely, and computers became my friends. So I was always this whiz kid. And when I started thinking about why I did this, much is originated from my childhood, because what I learned is that my father used to have access to computers on his business, in his company, and I suddenly had access with a small 1K RAM computer. Suddenly these things got democratized, and that's what people who now grew up with the internet and were born with where everything was in place, they haven't seen the whole race to the bottom in terms of price, but the democratization and democratizing these things was extremely helpful for people. So that was one part. The second thing is that I worked internationally, and with IBM, I was responsible for Central Eastern Europe, and Central Eastern Europe is also Europe, but then you start to see health inequalities. We started thinking or talking about cancer strategies and how we could help building registries, but then you discover that some regions don't have access to resources because Western European countries take these resources away because we lack doctors, so we take them from the eastern part. And you start to understand that from a global perspective, healthcare looks a bit different than from your local perspective. And then you see people who don't have access and perhaps who die where when he would have been born in Germany, he would have lived. So it was based on the place you born, you lived, your friends, your thing that defines if you're going to live or not. And that makes you think. And the third experience was that I was in Africa for as well a cancer research project, which was driven by the COSIR and the World Health Organization, IARC, which is a subdivision, the International Cancer Organization, the International Organization for Research in Cancer. And then we were trying to build cancer registries, and it was quite naive to think that we could build cancer registries because it assumes that you have the data to fill these registries. And I follow people in Kenya, in different African countries, and it was really shocking to see how the lack of infrastructure was. And then we started to rethink, and there was this a team from IBM in Israel that actually connected, and then out of this a startup was created that did something differently. So normally, for example, for HPV detection, which is the human papillomavirus that creates cervical cancer, which is most probably the biggest cancer or one of the three most prevalent cancers in Africa. But to be able to do that, you need a pap smear test. So a pap smear, you take a sample, you put it into a lab, you need a pathologist who looks if these viruses are there. But like in a country like Niger, which has 20 million inhabitants, you had 3 registered pathologists. So like, there's no way you can detect these viruses if you don't have the infrastructure. So that startup started using a very different method, using a 3D printed add-on for an Android phone, and it took pictures of the cervix when it was after we applied acids and a kitchen acid to it, which is really cheap. And 5 years later, the startup published papers that they were more accurate as the pap smear test by just using a mobile phone and taking pictures. And I celebrated this, and the problem was that the startup got funded by one of the biggest VCs. Not a problem, it got funded by one of the VCs. We should celebrate funding. But the problem was then that the focus was really to create this asset, and they defocused from Africa, and they moved there, and the asset they created on the patients of the data of the patients in Africa, of course, then served different markets, and that's what we could call data colonialism or appropriation. And then you start to learn these things are really complex to solve. And I started then thinking like, okay, if we equal data to capital, data accumulations will follow capital concentrations. We will do all the same again. We will replicate inequalities, existing inequalities, into the digital sphere, digital realm, and we have the chance to do this differently. And I said like, well, it's probably one of the biggest problems you can tackle. And I was as crazy to take that problem, and I have a good wife that supports me. They said like, you should do this. And I called my boss and I quitted my job and I started on probably the most craziest journey in my life, which is not an easy journey, but it's one of the most, how do you say it, is like fulfilling journeys that I could work for.
Yeah, that's also a long journey, as we hear you speak a little bit or elaborate a little bit about all of the stops you made. But you talked a little bit about the difficulty. Now, what are the biggest challenges that you've been facing in these last 3 years that you've been fighting for open source AI and data commons?
I think the main challenge is I interviewed, like at the beginning, quite a lot of people, like the founders of Doctors Without Borders, and they said like try to be as neutral as possible. And neutral means don't take government money, which is then difficult if you want to grow, because you are not a for-profit company. You need to fund things, and people don't understand it. Like, people have no relationship to data. Like, try to convince your friends to go from WhatsApp to Signal. They don't understand. So there's this really misconception in people about digital worlds. They don't understand this, and so that's really difficult. So, and if you want to create a foundation, a charitable foundation, you need to get funding. So the biggest problem is really funding. So it's been a mission that is um, growing slowly, but we are starting. And so, like, if you perhaps it's a curve that goes exponential, but the first years is going to be totally flat. And if you look at only from those years, it's going to be flat. But I believe that because of the people I spoke to, that there are so many people, and we heard it today, that want this other future,
Yes.
this different one that builds down or breaks down the walls of inequality and designs a system that perhaps leverage the economy. I'm not against profit. I'm not against capitalism in that sense, but I think we are stuck in healthcare where we have that model, what we talked with Shalini, Professor Shalini this morning, that we are stuck in this model of artificial scarcity, and I think we can do this very differently. And then one of the things that I reminded, which was an interesting conversation, I had a one-to-one discussion between the CEO of Roche and me, which was really awkward that I get this opportunity to have a 1.5 hour panel discussion, like battle discussion. And he first called me a communist, which was really strange because it's exactly the same thing happened 20 years ago when Bill Gates called Linux communism. Like, he said open source is communism and it destroys all the potential values. Now, Microsoft is now the biggest supporter of open source. So I said to Severin Schwan, I have a deja vu, you sound exactly like Steve Ballmer, who was the other CEO of Microsoft, who called open source a cancer cell. And he didn't like that analogy, but I showed to him a presentation that Gutenberg had the same conversations. And that's the difficult part. You need to convince people that letting go of control and moving further will create a much more flourishing economy. But of course, the incumbents, the companies that own the current model, will always resist. And these are very powerful organizations.
Yes.
And that's difficult. Yeah.
Definitely, yes. Yeah, we've heard a lot about this also today. I mean, or I have always picked up the keyword islands of privatization, which is maybe a problem for the European health data space, or can be a problem. Now, maybe let's move to the European health data space, because we've heard also from the keynote by Jan Sigmundowski about it, and you asked Jan, towards the end, if you had one chance to rewrite the proposal, what would you implement? And I would like to ask you the same question, because he said patient supervisory boards. He wanted to have mandatory patient supervisory boards. What would be your changes? What would you want to implement into the European health data space?
I loved Jan's keynote, but I think just patient advisory board is a good step, but it's definitely not enough, because if you are a patient, you have a motivation that is much more self-driven because of your own disease instead of community or driven by the 5 or 10 years perspective or next generation thinking, like they were indigenous people who thought 5 generations back. So we should actually invite somebody who is not born to think what are the consequences for me, so when you take these decisions. And I think what the European health data space should do is allow citizens to as well create access their full data set, and then use the Data Governance Act and the Data Trust for Data Altruism, so we can also create a world that is purely driven on openness. And if people tell me like open source doesn't work, and it's like, well, if you think that, then what are you afraid of giving us access? Like, if you think that this doesn't work, then why are you keeping the barriers down? Why are you building walls? Like, if you are so afraid, if you are not such a strong believer, why are you building walls? And so we should watch out that, like, that sentence that is written in the European data space, that IP can be still allowed, should vanish. Like, if that's the case, the system is designed for inequality. So my wish to change is really much more citizen power, not in the advisory board, and an integration in the Data Governance Act that uses the data trust for data altruism, and then perhaps a legal grounding for the copyright license that we need, copyleft license that we need, that we are discussing with quite a lot of people, as you heard, and make a legal foundation so we can act in a legal way. We don't want to do anything illegal, but we want to build a system that allows us to create something that will transform healthcare and make it make inequality a thing of the past.
Yes. Could you just briefly elaborate, because maybe some of the viewers are not aware, if we talk about copyleft, what is meant by copyleft? If you say we want to have a copyleft instead of a copyright system.
Well, that's what we had with the discussion with Paul Keller. It is a license that actually tells you if you take this data and you create extractions of it, or you take it comes from software code. So you have something that you take, then all the extensions that you make and all the things you have to make that available under that same license. That means that people who share expect others who use it to share. It's a restrictive license model, like open source. Like the open source community didn't like this kind of model, but I think now with data and AI we have to think further. And I think if people give consent to use the data for research, but others take that and appropriate this and build walls around it, that perhaps when these people who donated the data, when they need access to the extractions and don't get access to these extractions because of the prices or the unaffordability of it, then this is unethical. Like I think this is problematic. So we need to see that we break down these walls, and that can be done by that license. That means that if we put a license on data, but we have still a lot of legal issues, but a license on the data that we give consent to use, that we as patients or citizens are empowered to tell others that if you use our data, you're not allowed to build walls around everything what you create around it. You can still commercialize it. I have nothing against commercialization. I have something against creating a scarcity around things that aren't scarce.
Yes. Yes, those are the words for today, I would say. You've talked about the digital, the European Health Data Space and Digital Governance Act. Tomorrow we will hear more about the AI Act. And tomorrow we will also speak with Peter Kapitein, or Peter Kapitein will give a lecture giving us the patient's view. And we will have a lecture by Tamar Sharon, who is a philosopher. So we will continue a broad dialogue and a broad conversation. I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow. And now we have 10 minutes over the time. So the technical hiccups that we had over the day, we were able to catch up. And tomorrow we hope we can get through the day without any disturbance from the technical side. I'm looking forward to it, and I wish you all a good evening. Bye-bye.